Either there's someone living in my house or my schizophrenia is back. It started last Wednesday when I woke up to my coffee mug in the wrong place and a plate I hadn't used chilling in the sink. My boyfriend had been over the night before, so I figured he must have just forgotten to wash up. But then 2 days later, the living room window was open when I got home from work. I'd closed it that morning and specifically remembered struggling with it, so I was freaked out. I called my landlord immediately, asking if he'd been by, but he said no. All my doors were locked, however, and everything was still in place. I have a schizoaffective disorder, but I've been symptom-free thanks to meds for a long time, so the idea that I could be losing it was really freaking me out. My boyfriend said I was stressed and forgetting things, and I thought maybe he was right. But then the noises started. I started hearing scratching sounds in the walls at night that sounded like something was trying to get through. An exterminator came out and said it was probably mice, but the sounds just got louder and more deliberate. I started hearing what sounded like footsteps above my bedroom around 3 a.m. every night. A handyman checked the attic but didn't find anything unusual. That night, I woke up to someone breathing in my room, heavy and labored. I lay there frozen before I worked up the courage to turn on the light. The room was empty, but my closet door was hanging wide open, even though I'd closed it before bed. I called the police and 2 cops searched everywhere but didn't find anything. One of them suggested I might be having anxiety-related episodes, and that old buildings made all kinds of sounds at night. So I booked an emergency appointment with my psych who adjusted my meds, and I hoped to God that would be the end of it. But then food started disappearing too. Leftovers I'd been planning to eat just vanished, and raw chicken disappeared from my freezer overnight. I set up my phone to record the kitchen, but when I checked the footage, there was a 3-hour gap where the screen just went black. My boyfriend broke up with me after I showed him the video. He said I needed professional help. My mom called after he told her everything and suggested I talk to my doctor about anxiety medication. The breathing came back every single night, closer each time. One night, I woke up to someone touching my hair and running their fingers through it. I turned on the light and nobody was there. But when I looked in the mirror, I had a long scratch down my neck that hadn't been there before. I stopped sleeping and would just sit up in bed with all the lights on and a knife in my hand. I'd still hear movement in my hallway. One night, the door handle shook, like someone was trying to open it but wasn't strong enough. My landlord called and said other tenants were complaining about me calling the police all the time. He said if it kept happening, he'd have to ask me to leave. I promised I'd go back to my doctor, but I didn't want someone to tell me I was crazy anymore. I knew what I was hearing. I bought security cameras and set them up in every room. I watched the footage obsessively, but nothing showed up except me walking around alone. Every night, I'd still hear the breathing and footsteps, and every morning I'd wake up with new scratches. My clothes started showing up in strange places. A shirt balled up under my couch, underwear stuffed in a kitchen cabinet, socks folded on top of the refrigerator. The scratching sounds in the walls got louder and more frantic. I called a contractor who cut a hole in my drywall and said there was nothing there except normal wall studs. When I kept insisting something was in there, he looked at me like I was crazy. That night, I heard the breathing right outside my bedroom door. I could see a shadow blocking the light from under the door, and it stayed there for over an hour. I checked the camera footage the next morning, and there was nothing there. Just an empty hallway all night. The crawl space under my apartment was the only place I hadn't checked. I found the access panel and squeezed through with a flashlight. In the far corner, I found a pile of my clothes arranged like a nest. There were photos scattered around showing me sleeping and showering, and when I shined my flashlight up, I could see deep scratch marks in the wood right under where my bed sat. Right then, I heard a soft creaking sound from the hallway. A section of the wall was opening, and I could see a panel I'd never noticed before being pushed out about an inch from the inside. I watched as it slowly started to close. I ran over and pressed both hands against the wall as hard as I could, but it felt completely solid and I couldn't find any seam or edge. I knocked on it and the sound was hollow. There was a space behind my wall big enough for someone to move around in. I scrambled out of the crawl space and ran to my bedroom to grab my phone. My hands shook so bad I dropped it twice before I could dial 911. The operator answered and I tried to explain what I found, but my words came out jumbled and panicked. She asked if I was in immediate danger, and I said I didn't know, because someone had been living in my walls. She told me to leave the apartment and wait outside while she sent officers. I grabbed my keys and purse and stood in the hallway outside my door, pressing my back against the wall opposite my apartment. Every sound made me jump. I kept staring at my door expecting it to open from the inside. 20 minutes felt like hours before I heard sirens. 2 uniformed officers came up the stairs first and asked me to describe what I found. I showed them photos on my phone of the nest and pictures and scratch marks. One officer called for a detective while the other asked me to wait in the stairwell. Detective Thorne arrived about 20 minutes later wearing jeans and a blazer like she'd been off duty. She had short gray hair and tired eyes, but she listened to everything I said without interrupting. She asked if I'd touched anything in the crawl space, and I said I'd taken photos, but left everything where it was. She told me to stay in the hallway while they searched, and I sat on the floor with my back against the wall trying not to throw up. I could hear them moving through my apartment, opening doors and closets, their radios crackling. One officer found the crawl space entrance and called the others over. I heard camera shutters clicking and voices discussing what they were seeing. Detective Thorne came out after about 30 minutes and crouched down next to me. She said they found everything I described and were treating this as an active criminal investigation. Hearing those words made something break loose in my chest. This wasn't anxiety. This wasn't my illness coming back. Someone had actually been in my home. Detective Thorne went back inside and I heard more movement, more photos being taken. They searched the walls and found the panel I'd seen moving. One officer tried to pry it open but couldn't find the release mechanism. They marked it with tape and took measurements. After another hour, Detective Thorne came back out and told me they'd searched everywhere, but whoever was here was gone. She explained that the person probably heard me calling 911 and escaped through an exterior vent or basement access before they arrived. The building had multiple exit points someone could use. She asked me to come back inside to give a formal statement. Crime scene techs were dusting my walls for fingerprints and collecting fiber samples from the crawl space. I sat at my kitchen table while Detective Thorne asked detailed questions about the timeline. When did I first notice things out of place? When did the sounds start? When did I see the panel moving? I answered everything as clearly as I could, giving her exact dates and times. She took notes on a small tablet and recorded our conversation on her phone. She asked for copies of all my security camera footage even though I explained it never showed the intruder. She said sometimes cameras catch things we don't notice at first, and the tech team could enhance the footage. I gave her access to the cloud storage where everything was saved. One of the techs came over and asked Detective Thorne to look at something in the crawl space. They both went back down and I heard them talking in low voices. When Detective Thorne came back, she sat across from me and said the evidence was strong enough to prove someone was accessing my space. They'd found fingerprints on the panel edge and DNA samples from the nest area. But without catching the person in the act or identifying them from the database, the investigation would take time. I asked if I was safe staying here and she paused before answering. She said she couldn't make that promise. They'd sealed the access points they found, but the building was old and might have other ways in. She suggested I stay somewhere else until they caught whoever did this. After the police left, I sat on my couch staring at the walls. The apartment felt different now, like the walls themselves were watching me. I couldn't tell what was real structure and what might be hiding another secret panel. Every surface felt like it could open up and someone could reach through. I thought about all the nights I'd slept here while someone watched from behind the walls. All the times I'd showered and dressed and lived my life while they took photos. My hands started shaking again, and I knew I couldn't stay here another night. I went to my bedroom and packed a bag with clothes, toiletries, my medications, and my laptop. I grabbed my phone charger and some snacks from the kitchen. I took one last look around the apartment and locked the door behind me. I walked 6 blocks to a budget hotel I'd passed before and paid for 3 nights with my credit card. The room was small and smelled like cigarette smoke, but it had a deadbolt and chain on the door. I could see the parking lot from the window. I pushed the desk chair against the door even though I'd locked it. I checked the closet and bathroom to make sure they were empty. I looked under the bed. I checked that the window was locked. Then I sat on the bed and started crying. That first night at the hotel, I slept for 11 hours straight without waking once. No breathing sounds, no scratching, no footsteps, just silence and safety. When I woke up the next morning, I felt more rested than I had in months. The quiet proved to me that everything happening at the apartment was real. My body knew the difference between safety and danger even when my mind doubted itself. I called my mom and told her everything. I described finding the nest and photos and scratch marks. I told her about the police search and the evidence they found. I explained that Detective Thorne opened a criminal investigation. Mom was quiet for a long time. Then she said she was sorry for suggesting I just needed anxiety medication. She said she should have believed me from the start. I could hear her crying on the other end of the line. She asked if I was safe now, and I told her about the hotel. She offered to come stay with me, but I said I was okay for now. We talked for almost an hour, and by the end, I felt less alone than I had in weeks. My ex texted me that afternoon asking if I was okay. He said my mom had called him and told him what happened. I stared at the message for a long time. He had his chance to believe me when I needed him. Instead, he broke up with me and told everyone I needed professional help. He didn't get to pretend he cared now that there was proof. I deleted the message without responding and blocked his number. The next morning, I called Dr. Carey's office and told the receptionist I needed an emergency appointment. She squeezed me in at 2 that afternoon. I brought my phone with all the photos Detective Thorne had let me take copies of. I sat in the waiting room bouncing my leg and checking the time every few minutes. When Dr. Carey called me back, I followed her to her office and sat in the chair across from her desk. She asked how I was doing, and I just shook my head. I pulled out my phone and started showing her the pictures. The nest of my clothes in the crawl space, the photos of me sleeping, the scratch marks in the wood, the hidden panel in my wall. She looked at each one carefully and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she put my phone down on her desk and leaned forward. She told me she was so sorry that everyone, including her, had doubted what I was experiencing. She explained that what I'd been going through wasn't psychosis or hallucinations. It was a normal response to an actual threat. She said my brain was doing exactly what it should do when someone is in danger. It was protecting me by staying alert. She explained that trauma responses and psychotic symptoms look different, and what I described was clearly trauma from a real situation, not a break from reality. Hearing her say that made something tight in my chest finally loosen. I started crying and couldn't stop for several minutes. She handed me tissues and waited. When I could talk again, I told her I'd been so scared that I was losing my mind. She said my perceptions were accurate all along and I should trust myself. We talked for almost an hour about safety planning and coping strategies. She adjusted my anxiety medication but said my other meds were working fine. Before I left, she told me to call her anytime if I needed support during the investigation. I walked out of her office feeling lighter than I had in months. Someone finally believed me completely. My phone rang while I was driving back to the hotel. It was Detective Thorne. I pulled over into a parking lot to answer. She said they'd lifted a partial fingerprint from the edge of the panel in my wall. The crime scene techs had sent it to the database for analysis. I asked how long that would take, and she said it depends. If the person has a prior arrest record and their prints are in the system, they might get a match within days. But if the person has never been arrested, the database won't have anything to compare it to. She warned me not to get my hopes up too high because partial prints are harder to match than full ones. I thanked her for the update and she said she'd call as soon as she heard anything. After we hung up, I sat in my car staring at the steering wheel. The idea that they might actually identify whoever did this felt both hopeful and terrifying. Part of me wanted to know who it was. Another part of me was scared of finding out. I needed more clothes and some other things from my apartment, so I drove there the next afternoon when the sun was still high. The building looked different in daylight, less threatening somehow. I parked on the street and walked up to the entrance. When I got to my floor, the landlord was standing in the hallway outside my door. He was talking on his phone but hung up when he saw me. He asked why the police had been there and if everything was okay. His tone was weird, like he was annoyed more than concerned. I unlocked my door but didn't invite him in. He kept talking, saying other tenants had seen the squad cars and were asking questions. He said it wasn't good for the building's reputation. I just stared at him. He was more worried about what the neighbors thought than about the fact that someone had been living in the walls watching me. I told him the police found evidence that someone had been accessing my apartment through hidden panels and the crawl space. His face changed and he started talking really fast. He said old buildings like this have all kinds of quirks and weird spaces. He said maybe I misunderstood what I saw. Maybe it was just old construction materials or something the previous tenant left behind. I pulled out my phone without saying anything. I opened the photo app and turned my phone toward him. I showed him the picture of the nest made from my clothes. Then the photos of me sleeping that someone had taken. Then the scratch marks in the wood right under where my bed sat. His face went pale and he stopped talking. He stared at the screen like he couldn't process what he was seeing. Then he looked up at me and his expression was different. Less defensive, more scared. He asked if the police really found all that and I said yes. He was quiet for a minute. Then he cleared his throat and said he'd have his handyman come seal up the crawl space access right away. He said they'd patch the wall panel too, so nobody could get through anymore. I told him no. I said the police weren't done processing the scene yet and nothing could be touched until they cleared it. He started arguing, saying it was his building and his property. He had a right to make repairs and secure the premises. I looked him straight in the eye and said my lawyer told me not to let anyone alter the crime scene. I didn't actually have a lawyer yet, but saying it made him stop talking. He asked what lawyer and I said I wasn't discussing my legal representation with him. He stood there for another minute looking uncomfortable. Then he said we'd talk later and walked away down the hall. I went back to the hotel and called my mom. I asked if she knew any lawyers who handle tenant rights and stalking cases. She was quiet for a second, then said she'd ask around. Within an hour, she texted me 3 names with phone numbers. I called all of them and left messages explaining my situation. I said I needed help dealing with my landlord and understanding what my legal options were. 2 of the offices said they'd call me back within a day or 2. The third one, a lawyer named Lisa, had a receptionist who put me through right away. Lisa listened to my whole story without interrupting. When I finished, she said this sounded serious and she wanted to help. She offered a free consultation, and we set up a meeting for the next afternoon at her office. That night at the hotel, I sat on the bed with my laptop and started looking at my bank account. The hotel was costing me $90 a night. I'd already been there almost a week. My rent was still due on my apartment even though I couldn't stay there. I did the math in my head and felt sick. I had maybe 2 more weeks before I'd run out of money completely. After that, I'd have to choose between paying rent on an apartment I was too scared to sleep in or paying for a hotel where I actually felt safe. Either way, I'd go broke. I thought about asking my mom for money, but she was already helping so much. I thought about getting a second job, but I could barely function at my current one. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The weight of everything felt crushing. Someone had violated my home and my safety, and now I was the one paying for it. It didn't seem fair, but I didn't know what else to do. Lisa's office was in a small building downtown. I got there 15 minutes early and sat in my car going through all my documentation. I'd printed out the police report and photos. I'd written a timeline of everything that happened with dates. I'd saved all the texts and emails from my landlord. When it was time, I walked in and the receptionist showed me to Lisa's office. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She shook my hand and told me to sit down. I spread all my papers and photos on her desk. She spent almost 20 minutes just reading through everything and looking at the pictures. She asked questions about the timeline and took notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at me. Lisa said my landlord has a legal duty to provide what's called habitable housing. That means the apartment has to be safe and secure. She said having someone able to access my unit through hidden panels and crawl spaces is a serious breach of that duty. She explained that the evidence the police found proves the building had major security failures. She said based on everything I'd shown her, I had strong grounds to break my lease without any penalty. I wouldn't owe the remaining rent and I'd get my security deposit back. I asked if she was sure and she nodded. She said the law is clear that landlords have to provide basic safety and mine had completely failed to do that. She also said I should document all my costs related to this, like the hotel and the security cameras I bought. Those could be part of a damages claim later. Lisa kept talking and explained I had other options too. She said I could file a complaint with the housing authority about the security failures in the building. An inspector would come out and document all the code violations. That would create an official record and might force the landlord to fix the problems so this doesn't happen to other tenants. She also said I could potentially sue my landlord for damages. That would include the emotional distress, the cost of therapy, the hotel bills, and anything else I'd paid for because of his failure to maintain a safe building. She said we'd need to wait and see what happens with the criminal investigation first, but I should keep track of everything. Hearing all these options made me feel something I hadn't felt in weeks, like I wasn't completely powerless, like maybe I could fight back against what happened to me. I asked Lisa what the next steps were, and she said first we'd send my landlord a letter terminating my lease, then we'd file the housing authority complaint. After that, we'd see how he responds, and whether we need to take further legal action. I thanked her, and we set up another meeting for the following week. When I left her office, I felt more in control than I had since this whole nightmare started. I decided to start with the housing authority complaint since it was free and would create an official record of everything. Lisa pulled up the form on her computer, and we went through it section by section. I gave her all the dates I could remember. The first weird thing with the coffee mug, the open window, the breathing sounds, the scratching in the walls, the photos in the crawl space, the moving panel. She typed everything while I talked and added details from the police report. The form asked about safety issues and code violations. Lisa wrote about the hidden access points and the crawl space that let someone move between units. She included the scratch marks under my bed and the nest made from my clothes. When we finished, she read it back to me and asked if anything was wrong or missing. It sounded complete, so we submitted it electronically right there in her office. The confirmation email came through 2 minutes later with a case number. Lisa printed it out and put it in a folder with my name on it. She said the housing authority usually responds within a week to schedule an inspection. I thanked her again and drove back to the hotel feeling like I'd actually done something useful instead of just being scared. The next morning, Detective Thorne called while I was getting ready for work. She said they wanted to do a bigger search of the building, especially the basement and service areas. The problem was they needed either the landlord's permission or a warrant. She was working on the warrant application, but it required showing probable cause that evidence of a crime was in those specific areas. I asked what that meant, and she explained they had to prove to a judge that there was good reason to believe they'd find something criminal down there. The evidence from my crawl space helped, but it would be stronger if they had more than just my statements. I remembered the neighbor who'd mentioned seeing someone near the basement late at night. I told Detective Thorne about it, and she asked for the neighbor's contact information. I gave her the apartment number and the neighbor's name. She said having a witness who wasn't me would really strengthen the case. Someone else seeing suspicious activity proved this wasn't just about my apartment. It showed a pattern of someone accessing the building in ways they shouldn't. That night at the hotel, I couldn't sleep even though I was exhausted. I opened my laptop and started making a detailed timeline of everything. I put in dates and times for every incident I could remember. The coffee mug on Wednesday morning. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The window on Friday afternoon. The first night of scratching sounds. The breathing that started a week later. The food disappearing. My boyfriend breaking up with me. Finding the crawl space. I wrote descriptions of what happened and how I felt. I included who I called and what they said. The police visits, the exterminator, the handyman, the contractor. I saved copies of all the texts from my landlord. I downloaded the security camera files even though they didn't show anything. If this went to court or I needed to prove my case to the housing authority, I wanted records that showed I wasn't making things up. I wanted to show I was organized and credible and keeping track of facts. 3 days later, the housing authority sent an inspector to my apartment. His name was Elliot Hunt, and he showed up right on time with a tablet and a big camera. He spent 2 hours going through everything. He measured the crawl space opening and took photos from every angle. He tested the wall panel where I'd seen it moving and took more pictures. He crawled into the crawl space himself with a flashlight and stayed down there for almost 20 minutes. When he came back up, his clothes were dirty and he was making notes on his tablet. He checked the basement door and the laundry room. He looked at the vents and the utility closets. He measured distances between walls and compared them to the building layout. The whole time he kept taking photos and writing things down. When Elliot was almost done, he told me something off the record. He said in 15 years of inspections, he'd never seen anything like this. The building layout created multiple access points between units that weren't secured properly. There were gaps in the walls where service chases ran. The crawl space had openings that should have been sealed. The basement had doors that should have been locked but weren't. He said it violated current safety codes in several ways. He couldn't promise what the housing authority would do with his report, but he was going to document every violation he found. His tone made it clear he thought this was serious. I asked if other tenants were at risk, and he said based on what he was seeing, yes. Anyone on the ground floor could potentially be accessed the same way I was. My landlord called me that afternoon and he was angry. Really angry. He said I was trying to destroy his business over what he called a misunderstanding. He said the housing authority inspector had been there for hours and was taking pictures of everything. He said other tenants were asking questions and getting worried. He accused me of making a big deal out of nothing and said if I kept this up, he'd sue me for defamation. His voice got louder as he talked, and I could tell he was more worried about his reputation than about what happened to me. He said I was costing him money and causing problems, and he wanted me to call off the investigation. And I didn't say much because I was too shocked by how mad he was. When he finally stopped talking, I told him I had to go and hung up. My hands were shaking, so I opened the voice recorder app on my phone and played back the call. I'd started recording halfway through without really thinking about it. I had about 3 minutes of him yelling and threatening to sue me. I sent the audio file to Lisa right away with a message explaining what happened. She emailed back within an hour. She said his threats were legally baseless and actually helped my case. She was drafting a cease and desist letter, telling him to only contact me through her office from now on. She said his behavior showed he was more interested in protecting himself than fixing the safety problems. That made him look bad if this ever went to court. 2 days later, Detective Thorne called with good news. The judge approved her warrant and they were scheduling a full building search for the following Tuesday. She asked if I was willing to be there to identify any of my belongings they might find. I said yes, even though the thought of going back to that building made my stomach hurt. She said I didn't have to go inside or see anything disturbing. I could wait outside and they'd bring things out for me to look at if needed. I agreed because I wanted to help, and because I wanted to see them find proof that I wasn't crazy. The day before the search, I called in sick to work. I hadn't been sleeping well even at the hotel, and I was making mistakes at my job. I'd sent an email to the wrong client and forgotten about a meeting. My supervisor was understanding when I called, but she mentioned I'd missed several days recently. She said we should talk about whether I needed to take formal leave. I told her I'd think about it and we'd talk after things settled down. I spent the rest of the day in my hotel room trying to rest, but mostly just staring at the ceiling and thinking about what the police might find on Tuesday. That night, I took the medication and lay in the hotel bed staring at the ceiling until almost 3 in the morning. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw more photos of myself that might be hidden somewhere in those walls. I kept imagining cameras tucked into vents or behind light fixtures, recording everything I did for months. The medication was supposed to help me sleep, but my brain wouldn't shut off. I finally dozed off around 4 and woke up at 6 feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. I showered and got dressed in clothes that felt wrong no matter what I picked. Everything seemed too casual or too formal for watching police search my apartment for evidence that someone had been living in my walls. I left the hotel at 6:30 and drove to my building even though I was way too early. I sat in my car in the parking lot watching the sun come up and trying not to throw up. Detective Thorne pulled up at exactly 7 with 3 squad cars behind her. I got out and walked over as she was talking to the other officers. She saw me and nodded. The landlord's truck was already there and he was standing by the entrance with his arms crossed. He looked at me for maybe half a second before looking away. His face was red and his jaw was clenched tight. Detective Thorne walked over to him first, and they talked in low voices while I stood by my car. I could see him shaking his head and pointing at the building. She said something back and he threw his hands up but pulled out his keys. The officers started unloading equipment from their cars. 2 of them had cameras and evidence bags. Another one had a big toolbox. Detective Thorne came over to me and asked if I was okay to be here. I said yes, even though I wasn't sure that was true. She told me they'd start in the basement and work their way up. She said I should wait outside unless they needed me to identify something. I nodded and stayed by my car while they all went inside. The search took forever. I sat in my car for the first hour, but then I couldn't sit still anymore, so I walked around the parking lot. Other tenants started leaving for work, and some of them stared at all the police cars. One woman I recognized from the second floor asked what was happening. I told her the police were investigating a break-in. She looked worried and hurried to her car. Around 9:30, Detective Thorne came out and asked me to come inside. My legs felt shaky walking through the entrance. She led me down to the basement and the door to the laundry room was propped open. I could see officers inside taking pictures of something behind the water heater. She walked me over and pointed to a sleeping bag wadded up in the corner behind the big metal tank. Next to it were empty food containers and plastic water bottles. A backpack was sitting on top of the sleeping bag. Everything was covered in dust like it had been there a while. One of the officers was putting the food containers into evidence bags. Detective Thorne asked if I recognized any of it, and I said no. She nodded and said they were bagging everything for prints and DNA. We went back upstairs and she showed me the access points they'd found. There was a panel in the hallway wall that looked like regular drywall, but it lifted right out. Behind it was a gap about 2 feet wide that ran along the whole building. She shined her flashlight in, and I could see where the space connected to vent openings. In my apartment, they found 2 more removable panels I'd never noticed. One was behind my bookshelf and another was in the bathroom ceiling. The officer taking pictures said the panels were cut professionally and put back, so carefully you'd never spot them unless you knew what to look for. They found loose vent covers in 3 different units that gave access to the service chase. Detective Thorne said someone could move through the entire ground floor without ever being seen. Around noon, they brought the backpack up from the basement. Detective Thorne put on gloves and opened it on my kitchen table. Inside were more photos of me. Way more than what I'd found in the crawl space. Some showed me cooking dinner. Others showed me watching TV on my couch. There were photos of me sleeping in different positions like someone had been taking pictures over multiple nights. My hands started shaking and I had to sit down. She pulled out a spiral notebook and flipped through it. My work schedule was written down for the past 3 months. Every day I worked was marked with the time I left and the time I came home. There were notes about when my boyfriend used to visit and when my mom called. Everything about my routine was documented like I was some kind of research project. Detective Thorne's face was hard when she looked at me. She said this proved someone was watching me constantly and planning when to access my apartment. The backpack also had a small toolkit with screwdrivers in different sizes and a pry bar. She bagged everything separately and labeled each item. She told me this was systematic stalking and whoever did this had been at it for months. Around 2 in the afternoon, one of the officers called Detective Thorne over to the service chase opening in the hallway. They'd found a laptop wedged into a gap between the wall studs. She came and got me to look at it. The laptop was old and covered in dust. Detective Thorne said they'd need a separate warrant to search what was on it because electronics had different legal protections. She explained the tech forensics team would take it and apply for the warrant. It could have more photos or videos or information about who was doing this. I asked how long that would take, and she said probably a few days. She brought the backpack over and started taking things out one at a time, asking if I recognized them. There was a blue sweater I'd thought I lost when I moved into this apartment 2 months ago. A hairbrush that disappeared from my bathroom in October. A coffee mug from my kitchen that I'd looked for a dozen times. Seeing my stuff mixed in with the stalker's things made my stomach turn. These were my belongings that someone had taken and kept like trophies. Detective Thorne photographed each item next to a ruler for scale before bagging it. She said I'd get everything back eventually, but it was evidence now. The landlord came down to the basement while they were finishing up. He was talking loud, saying the sleeping bag and backpack could belong to a homeless person who broke in. Detective Thorne didn't even look at him. She pointed out that all the access points required keys or tools to reach. The service chase wasn't accessible from outside. Someone needed to know the building layout and have the ability to remove panels and vents from inside the units. She said a random homeless person wouldn't have that knowledge or access. He started arguing about how old buildings had weird spaces and maybe someone found a way in years ago. She cut him off and said the evidence showed recent activity and items stolen from my apartment specifically. This wasn't random. The search wrapped up around 3. Detective Thorne asked me to step outside with her. We stood by her car and she told me they were treating this as aggravated stalking and criminal trespass. The evidence was strong enough to prove someone was systematically targeting me and living in the building. She said they still needed to identify the suspect through fingerprints or DNA, or by catching them coming back. I asked if it was safe to go back to my apartment now that they'd cleared the hiding spaces. She was quiet for a second. Then she said they'd sealed the access points with screws and marked them so they'd know if someone tampered with them. But she couldn't promise someone wouldn't find another way in. Old buildings had lots of spaces and gaps. Her honesty scared me, but I was glad she wasn't lying to make me feel better. I told her I was staying at the hotel anyway. She said that was smart. 3 days later, I got a letter from the housing authority. They'd inspected my building after Elliot's report and found multiple code violations. The service chase wasn't properly sealed. The basement had unsecured access points. Several vent covers weren't installed to code. They were requiring the landlord to make immediate repairs and bring everything up to current safety standards. The letter also said I had the right to withhold rent until the violations were fixed, or break my lease without penalty. I wouldn't lose my security deposit, and I wouldn't be liable for the remaining months. I read the letter 3 times sitting on the hotel bed. For the first time since this started, I felt like someone besides Detective Thorne actually believed me and was doing something about it. I called Lisa the next morning and told her I wanted out of the lease completely. She said the housing authority letter gave me solid legal grounds and we could draft the termination notice that afternoon. I met her at her office and we spent 2 hours going over every detail, making sure we referenced the code violations, the police report, and my documented safety concerns. Lisa printed 3 copies and we sent them certified mail to the landlord with return receipt requested. Walking out of the post office felt like the first real control I'd had over my situation in months. 2 days later, the landlord's lawyer sent a response threatening to keep my entire security deposit for breaking the lease early. He claimed I was abandoning the property and violating the terms of my rental agreement. I forwarded the email to Lisa, and she called me within an hour. She said his threats were legally baseless given the circumstances and actually helped our case by showing harassment. Lisa drafted a response explaining that we had documented evidence of uninhabitable conditions and criminal activity, and that any attempt to withhold my deposit would result in a lawsuit for the emotional distress and costs I'd already paid for hotels and security measures. She sent it that afternoon and copied the housing authority. The landlord's lawyer backed down within 48 hours, sending a terse email agreeing to return my full deposit and release me from the lease. I started apartment hunting immediately, focusing on a different neighborhood across town. I needed a building with modern security, no basement access, and preferably an upper floor unit where nobody could reach my windows. The search was exhausting because every leasing agent asked why I needed such specific security features. I tried explaining without sounding paranoid, mentioning that I'd had a break-in at my last place and wanted better protection. Some of them looked at me weird anyway, like I was being difficult or paranoid. I toured 8 different buildings over 4 days, checking every detail obsessively. I needed to see the entry systems, the camera coverage, the lock mechanisms on the doors. One place had a doorman, but the apartments were ground floor with windows facing an alley. Another had great cameras, but anyone could access the stairwells without a keycard. I was starting to think I'd never find something that felt safe enough when Detective Thorne called. She said the fingerprint from my wall panel had come back with a match in the system. The person was named Rocky Hyde, a 34-year-old man with prior arrests for trespassing and burglary. He'd been off the grid for 6 months with no current address, but they'd issued a warrant for his arrest. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped my phone. I asked her to repeat the name and she spelled it out for me. Rocky Hyde. I'd never heard that name before in my life. Detective Thorne said she was emailing me his booking photo from his last arrest, and I should look at it carefully, see if I recognized him from anywhere. The email came through while we were still on the phone and I opened the attachment. The photo showed a thin man with hollow eyes and patchy facial hair, staring at the camera with a blank expression. I studied every detail of his face, trying to remember if I'd ever seen him at my building, at work, at the grocery store, anywhere. Nothing. He was a complete stranger, which somehow made everything worse. If he'd been someone I knew, someone with a reason to target me specifically, maybe I could have understood it. But this was just a random man who'd decided to crawl into my walls and watch me sleep. Detective Thorne explained their theory about how Rocky had access to my building. He used to work as a contractor's assistant about 3 years ago and learned about building layouts and access points through that job. He'd been living rough for the past 6 months, probably homeless or staying in shelters, and chose my building because he knew how to move through it undetected. She said the evidence suggested he'd been using the service chases and crawl space as a place to sleep and hide, and that stalking me might have started as opportunistic rather than planned. That didn't make me feel any better. She warned me that finding Rocky could take time since he was transient and knew how to avoid police. He wasn't using shelters under his real name and didn't have any known associates or family in the area. She suggested I consider filing for a protective order once they located him, and in the meantime, I should stay vigilant about my surroundings. If I saw anyone matching his description, I should call 911 immediately and not approach him. I thanked her and hung up, then stared at Rocky's photo for another 20 minutes. I saved it to my phone so I could check it whenever I saw someone who might be him. The next day, I found a new apartment in a building that checked every box on my list. 5th floor unit, doorman at the entrance 24 hours a day, cameras in all common areas, and keycard access required for the elevators and stairwells. The rent was $200 more per month than my old place, but my mom offered to help with the deposit when I called her. She said my safety was worth any cost, and she'd rather help me pay for a secure apartment than worry about me every night. I signed the lease that afternoon and got keys for a move-in date 2 weeks out. Moving day was bittersweet in a way I hadn't expected. I was relieved to leave the old apartment and never look back, but I was also angry that I was forced out of my home because someone had violated my space so completely. This wasn't my choice. I'd liked that apartment before everything happened. It had good light and was close to work, and the rent was affordable. Now I was paying more money to live farther away, all because some man decided to crawl into my walls. I hired professional movers instead of asking friends for help because I didn't want to explain why I was moving, so suddenly or field questions about what had happened. The movers showed up at 8 in the morning and had everything packed and loaded within 4 hours. I did one final walkthrough of the empty apartment, checking every closet and cabinet one last time. The walls looked normal now, just regular walls, but I knew what was behind them. I left the keys on the kitchen counter and walked out without looking back. The first night in my new apartment, I checked every lock 3 times before bed. I pushed my dresser against the door even though I was on the 5th floor and nobody could reach my windows without a ladder. I got up twice during the night to verify the locks again and check that the dresser hadn't moved. Dr. Carey had warned me during our last session that hypervigilance was a normal trauma response and would take time to fade. She said my brain had learned that my environment wasn't safe and it would need consistent evidence of safety before it could relax again. Knowing it was normal didn't make it any easier, but at least I understood why I couldn't stop checking the locks. 2 weeks passed in my new apartment, and I started to believe I might actually be safe there. Detective Thorne called on a Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for work, and I answered on the first ring. She told me Rocky had been arrested in a city 3 hours away after breaking into a storage facility, and the local police were holding him on the warrant from my case. She was working with them to get him transferred back for questioning, and wanted me to know he was finally in custody. I sat down on my bed because my legs felt shaky, and asked if this meant it was really over. She said it meant he couldn't hurt me anymore, but there was still a legal process ahead, and she needed to ask if I'd be willing to testify if the case went to trial. I said yes without even thinking about it because I needed Rocky to know I wasn't just some victim he could terrorize and get away with it. I was a real person who would stand up in court and make sure he faced real consequences for what he did to me. Detective Thorne said she'd keep me updated on the transfer and court dates, and I thanked her before hanging up. I called in late to work and sat there staring at my phone for 20 minutes trying to process that they'd actually caught him. A week later, Detective Thorne called again to say Rocky's public defender wanted to know if I'd meet with them for a victim impact statement. The idea of being in the same room as him made my stomach hurt, so I told her I needed to think about it. I scheduled an emergency session with Dr. Carey that afternoon and explained what the defender was asking. She listened carefully and then asked how I felt about seeing Rocky in person, and I admitted I wasn't ready for that at all. She said I didn't have to meet with him to give a statement and suggested I could write one instead that would be just as powerful. I decided that's what I'd do because I had things I needed to say about how his actions destroyed my sense of safety, but I couldn't handle being near him yet. I told Detective Thorne my decision the next day, and she said she'd let the defender know. Writing the statement took 3 full days because every time I tried to put words on paper, I'd start crying and have to walk away. I described the fear of waking up to breathing sounds and finding scratches on my body and not knowing if I was losing my mind. I wrote about how my boyfriend left me, and everyone thought I was having a breakdown when I was actually being stalked. I explained the trauma of knowing someone had watched me sleep and shower and lived in my walls for months. Each paragraph felt like reliving the worst parts, and I had to take long breaks to calm down before I could keep writing. When I finally finished, it was 4 pages long, and I read it out loud to myself twice to make sure it said everything I needed it to say. I emailed it to Detective Thorne, and she called an hour later to say it was powerful and would definitely impact the case. The district attorney's office filed formal charges a week after that, and the DA assigned to my case called to walk me through what would happen next. He listed the charges, which were aggravated stalking, criminal trespass, burglary, and invasion of privacy. He explained each one and said they were pursuing the maximum penalties because of Rocky's prior record and how disturbing and long this had gone on. I asked what maximum meant, and he said potentially 15 to 20 years depending on how things went. That number felt huge and real, and I thanked him for taking it seriously. He said my case was one of the worst he'd seen, and they wanted to make sure Rocky served actual prison time, instead of just getting probation. 2 weeks later, the DA called again to say Rocky's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but they weren't offering anything lenient. He said given the prior record and the disturbing nature of everything Rocky did, they wanted him behind bars for a long time. I felt relieved that they weren't going easy on him just to close the case quickly. The arraignment was scheduled for the following Monday, and Detective Thorne offered to come with me for support. I took another day off work and met her at the courthouse at 9 in the morning. We sat in the back of the courtroom, and I kept my hands folded in my lap to stop them from shaking. Rocky appeared on a video screen from the jail, and seeing his face on that screen made my heart start racing. So fast I thought I might pass out. I forced myself to keep watching as the judge read the charges and asked how he pleaded. His lawyer entered a not guilty plea and then argued for bail, but the prosecutor pushed back hard with details about the stalking and hidden living spaces. The judge denied bail and said Rocky would remain in custody until trial, and I felt Detective Thorne squeeze my shoulder. Walking out of the courthouse afterward, I felt dizzy but also stronger somehow because I'd made myself stay and watch. The preliminary hearing got scheduled for 6 weeks out, which meant 6 more weeks of waiting and wondering what would happen. Dr. Carey increased my therapy to twice a week to help me deal with the stress of the legal process and the anxiety of knowing this would drag on for months. My mom drove up for a long weekend visit and helped me make the new apartment feel more like an actual home instead of just a safe place to hide. We hung pictures on the walls and bought plants for the windowsills, and she showed me how to install a door security bar that I could take with me if I ever moved again. She didn't ask many questions about the case and instead focused on helping me create a space that felt comfortable and mine. Work had been understanding about all the time I needed for court dates and therapy appointments, but my supervisor pulled me aside to suggest I apply for the Employee Assistance Program. She explained it provided extra counseling sessions and legal consultation at no cost, and said several people in the office had used it during difficult times. I filled out the application that afternoon and got approved within a week, which took some financial pressure off since my therapy costs were adding up fast. I found a support group for stalking victims that met every Wednesday night at a community center about 20 minutes from my new apartment. The first meeting I attended had 7 other people sitting in a circle of folding chairs and a counselor named Maria, who explained the ground rules before we started sharing. I listened to a woman describe how her ex-boyfriend had followed her for 2 years, and a man talk about a coworker who left notes on his car every single day for months. Hearing their stories made me feel less alone because they all described the same thing I'd experienced, that moment when everyone around you thinks you're imagining it or making it too big of a deal. A college student shared tips about documenting everything with timestamps and keeping copies in multiple places. An older man explained how he'd learned to check his car for tracking devices after finding 3 of them over 6 months. By the end of that first meeting, I had a list of practical steps I hadn't thought of, like checking my credit report monthly and setting up alerts for any new accounts opened in my name. I kept going back every week, and the routine of it helped. having a place where I could talk about what happened without people looking at me like I was broken. Detective Thorne called me 3 weeks after Rocky's arrest with an update about the laptop they'd seized from the building. She said the forensic team had finished going through it and found hundreds of photos and videos of me taken over at least 5 months, maybe longer. The files were organized by date in folders on his desktop, and the earliest ones were from last October when I'd first moved into that apartment. She explained that the timestamps proved this wasn't some random thing, that Rocky had specifically chosen me and planned out how to access my space over months. There were videos of me sleeping, showering, getting dressed, cooking dinner, just sitting on my couch watching TV. The detective said some of the footage was taken through vents and others through the gaps around the hidden panels in my walls. She asked if I wanted to see any of it for identification purposes, and I said absolutely not, that knowing it existed was already more than I could handle. The laptop also had searches for my name, my workplace, my social media accounts, and notes about my daily schedule written in a document file. Detective Thorne said this level of planning and documentation would strengthen the case significantly because it showed clear intent and premeditation. The DA called me 2 days later to say they were adding new charges based on the digital evidence. The original charges were aggravated stalking, criminal trespass, and burglary, but now they were adding unlawful surveillance and possession of voyeuristic materials. He explained each charge and what it meant, that the unlawful surveillance covered the videos taken without my knowledge in private spaces, and the voyeuristic materials charge was for keeping and organizing those recordings. Each new charge made me feel 2 different ways at once, validated that the system was finally taking this seriously, and treating it like the violation it was, but also sick, knowing just how much Rocky had watched and recorded. The DA said with the additional charges, Rocky was now facing a potential maximum of 25 years, instead of the 15 we discussed before. He asked how I was holding up, and I told him I was managing, that my therapist was helping me process everything as it came up. He said the arraignment on the new charges would happen in 2 weeks, and I could attend if I wanted, but it wasn't required. Rocky's lawyer reached out through the DA's office one more time trying to negotiate a plea deal. The offer was that Rocky would plead guilty to reduced charges, just the trespass and 1 count of stalking, in exchange for a recommended sentence of 3 to 5 years. The DA called to get my input before responding, and I didn't even have to think about it. I told him I wanted Rocky to face the full consequences of every single thing he did, because he showed me absolutely no mercy while he was living in my walls and watching me. He'd made choices every single day for months to violate my privacy and safety, and I wasn't interested in making things easier for him now. The DA said he appreciated my position, and agreed that the evidence was strong enough that they didn't need to offer any deals. He told me they would reject the offer and proceed toward trial, which was scheduled for 8 weeks out. I met with the prosecutor twice over the next month to prepare for testifying. Her name was Sarah, and she worked for the DA's office handling stalking and harassment cases. The first meeting was in her office, where she explained what trial would be like, and what kinds of questions Rocky's lawyer might ask during cross-examination. She said defense attorneys often try to make victims seem unreliable or suggest they're exaggerating, and in my case, they might bring up my schizoaffective disorder to imply I'd imagine things. Sarah walked me through how to stay calm and focused on facts rather than getting emotional or defensive. We practiced with her asking me hard questions about my mental health history and my initial doubts about what was happening. The second meeting was a week before trial, and we went through my entire timeline of events, making sure I could clearly explain what happened when and what evidence supported each incident. She told me to take my time answering questions and to say if I didn't understand something or needed it repeated. 3 days before the trial was supposed to start, the DA called me with unexpected news. Rocky's lawyer had contacted them that morning to say Rocky wanted to accept a guilty plea to all charges, every single one, in exchange for the prosecution agreeing not to seek the maximum sentence. The DA explained this meant Rocky would get somewhere between 8 and 12 years, instead of the 15 to 25 he could face if we went to trial and won. He said a guilty plea would guarantee a conviction without putting me through the stress of testifying and being cross-examined about everything. I asked what would happen if we went to trial, and he said the evidence was very strong, but juries were unpredictable, and there was always a small chance Rocky could be found not guilty on some charges. The guaranteed conviction versus the risk of trial was something I needed to think about carefully. I talked it over with my mom and with Dr. Carrie before making my decision. The thought of sitting in a courtroom while Rocky's lawyer asked me questions about my mental health and tried to make me look unreliable felt unbearable. I'd already been through months of people not believing me and suggesting I was having episodes. 8 years meant Rocky would be in prison until I was almost 40. Which felt like enough time for me to rebuild my sense of safety and move forward with my life. I called the DA back and told him I agreed to the plea deal. He said the sentencing hearing would be scheduled for 3 weeks out, and I could read a victim impact statement if I wanted to. I told him I absolutely wanted to, that I needed Rocky to hear directly from me about what he'd done. The sentencing hearing was on a Tuesday morning in early June. I took the day off work and my mom drove up to be there with me. Detective Thorne met us outside the courthouse and walked in with us, which made me feel less alone. We sat in the gallery while Rocky was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him. Seeing him in person for the first time since finding the evidence made my heart start racing so fast I thought I might pass out, but I forced myself to keep looking at him. The judge asked if I was ready to read my statement, and I stood up on shaky legs and walked to the podium they'd set up. I unfolded the pages I'd spent 2 weeks writing and rewriting. I described every detail of those months. The fear of thinking I was losing my mind. The isolation when nobody believed me. Waking up to him touching my hair. The scratches on my neck. Finding his nest of my clothes in the crawl space. I talked about how his actions had shattered my sense of security and made me question my own reality and perception. I explained that I'd lost my relationship, my home, and my peace of mind because of his obsession. I watched him the entire time I read, and he stared down at the table in front of him, never once looking up at me. When I finished and sat back down, my hands were shaking, so hard my mom had to hold them still. The judge reviewed the case file and the plea agreement before addressing Rocky directly. She told him his actions were among the most disturbing violations of privacy and personal safety she'd encountered in her years on the bench. She sentenced him to 10 years in state prison with mandatory mental health treatment throughout his incarceration. She also issued a permanent restraining order that would extend beyond his release date, meaning he could never contact me or come within 5 feet, 100 feet of me for the rest of his life. After the judge finished, the bailiffs led Rocky out through a side door, and he still never looked at me once. Walking out of the courthouse afterward with Detective Thorne on one side and my mom on the other, I felt the weight of 6 months of fear finally start to lift off my shoulders. The legal process was over, and I could begin the work of actually moving forward with my life, knowing Rocky was locked up and couldn't hurt me anymore. That's where we'll end today's story. Thanks for being here. It really makes a difference knowing these words reach someone. I hope it added a bit of warmth to your day. Subscribe if you'd like to keep sharing stories like this together.